Fine with computer audio. Okay. Oh no, don't record. Recording. I think it's working. We'll see. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our virtual discussion of author Roncho's My Unforgotten Seattle. We have Ron here today to talk about his book with us. We also have copies here in the store, and I've also put a link in the chat if you want to purchase one online. Roncho served as editor of the International Examiner and as executive director of the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience. His books include Reflections of Seattle's Chinese Americans, the First 100 Years, and Remembering Silme Domingo and Jean Vernes, The Legacy of Filipino-American Labor Activism. After a reading and discussion, we will be doing an audience Q&A, so get your questions ready. We also plan to record and now live stream the event. So if you don't want to appear on video, please keep your cameras disabled, which I think everyone has. Please keep your mics muted most of the time. When it's time for questions, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask Ron your questions. Ron, I give the floor to you.
Okay, well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Jonah. Let's see, I think we're going to start a little bit with an introduction, a reading from the book. So I should mention the book is fairly thick. There's 600 pages. The type is fairly large. You can see the evidence there of the thickness, but a reassurance that it's pretty readable. The print, I think, Jonah can attest, is fairly large, a lot of chapters, 72 chapters. So I wrote it as a former journalist with the reader in mind, making it appear in a way that you could pop in and out of the story if you chose. So each chapter is sort of its own little mini story. And then there's lots of pictures in the middle, a huge photo section, which also is its own story in itself. If you're a visual person, just want to kind of read the book through pictures, you can literally go through and see the essence of the story emerge in visual form. So for purposes of this event, I thought I'd just read from the introduction, because again, it's just, I didn't want to delve too deeply into the stories, but this will set a backdrop of kind of the tone of the narrative. Also, before I read as well, just to give a shout out to the International Examiner, because this was written actually as a fundraiser for the International Examiner newspaper. So any proceeds from sales of the book go directly to the International Examiner. So I'm not actually making any money from it, but it was my effort to document and record some of my personal history, the history of the community that I grew up in, and then also to support the ethnic community media from which community I emerged during my early career. So I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction. In early fall of 2016, I left my house on Beacon Hill to start my 5 a.m. run. I donned my usual attire, a long-sleeved t-shirt, a neon yellow windbreaker, gloves, sweatpants, and a bright headlamp. My 2 sons slept. As busy as my life had become, I appreciated this time alone. The streets looked abandoned. I saw no walkers, moving vehicles, or lit windows. A brisk wind whipped past me, scattering dry leaves along the sidewalk. I looked over my shoulder to see the first rays of orange light the sky. My mind drifted back in time. I remembered when roads were dirt and gravel. There were a few cars, no traffic jams. I knew all my neighbors. Friends sent handwritten letters. Cell phones, the internet, personal computers, and social media didn't exist. The downtown skyline was dominated by the Smith Tower. I didn't feel uneasy about going anywhere late at night. The only major league sport in town was big-time wrestling. On my return jog, cars and buses began to fill the streets. Car horns, exhaust fumes, and pedestrians hurrying towards bus stops broke my reverie. The sun rose. It was bright. The wind died down. An old station wagon rattled by. I smelled weed. A sprinkle of rain touched my face. I shivered. I needed to hurry home to make breakfast for my kids and get ready for work. I'm going to skip over a little piece where I'm kind of reminiscing about a lot of recent deaths and the impact on me. Where were the people I grew up with? I didn't see them on Beacon Hill. I didn't bump into them in Chinatown. They resettled in places we once considered a separate universe. North Seattle, Shoreline, Everett, Bellevue, Issaquah, Maple Valley, Kent, Skyway, Burien, Federal Way, and Tukwila. I reconnected with them on Facebook, not in person. I felt like a ghost transported to the future. I was lost. I woke to discover notice of proposed land use action signs everywhere. Skinny new homes and tall apartment buildings cast jarring shadows over aging bungalows and ramblers. I felt claustrophobic. I struggled to find parking. SUVs, full-sized pickup trucks, camper vans, and boat trailers packed both sides of the road. Travel became an unsettling voyage along narrowed streets, new bike lanes, and pop-up construction sites. My new neighbors, young professionals, arrived all at once. They snatched up older homes, replacing rusty wrought iron railings with wood balusters. They tore up front lawns to make space for ornamental potted plants, stone statuary, and little garden benches. Along Beacon Avenue South, I saw roving bands of older homeless people began to camp under bus shelters, surrounded by black trash bags full of their possessions. The world I knew was nearly gone. I felt as if I had just watched an ice floe break apart, pieces sliding into a rising crest of vast, nameless ocean. Seattle would never be the same again. I was witnessing a kind of climate change, certain and irreversible. I acutely tasted my own mortality. I recalled the words of Henry Chin, a wizened old timer who lived in the Republic Hotel in Chinatown. I interviewed him in 1990 when he was nearly 90. In a poignant moment, he puzzled aloud over why he was still alive. He said his friends were all gone. He made me realize that most of us don't acquire new friendships when we become aged. We die lonely. In early September 2016, I began writing this memoir to pay homage to the city I once knew and the people and places that defined its character for me and a generation of peers. I went to my basement to scour personal papers, diaries from the 1970s and 80s, letters and other documents stored in dusty, neglected cardboard storage boxes, et cetera, et cetera. Skip over. I was reminded that our history is built on the precarious foundation of what is remembered, acknowledged, and disclosed. In the new Seattle, I still had much to discover of my own past. My work was not yet done. So that's a little bit of flavor of the narrative, and then I go through and write the stories.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That was great. So I have a couple questions for you about this work. My coworker and friend Francis actually helped out with some of these questions. Shout out. But our first question is, how did you decide what to include and what not to include in this memoir while writing it?
Good question. First of all, one only writes a memoir usually once. So it's a hard proposition. I also, Jonah, was trained as a journalist. So I'm used to writing like 600-700 words. So it was a little bit of a daunting task. I fortunately kept a journal from roughly 1972 through the 1980s. And then later, another set of journals up through another chunk of years. I also kept letters back in the day before, remember, we didn't have the internet. So people ask, well, how are you able to recreate these scenes? You know, because it's very specific. There's dialogue and descriptions and so forth. I said, well, you know, back in the day, you know, when friends moved out of town, people left the Pacific Northwest to go to New York City to find themselves. They wrote letters, and so I saved them all in the original envelopes. I've got dates, I have descriptions, dialogue, in my journals. So what I wrote that formed the basis of the memoir was documents which really were the pieces of information that I had from my past. I also have a fairly precise memory, and part of it is my journalistic training. You're trained to remember things and then go back and write stuff up. It's sort of a learned skill. So from those pieces, I was able to recreate people, places, things that left an impact on me, where I also had the ability to document and tell with some fairly rich detail. I also intentionally wanted to tell some stories that had not been told before. And what I mean by that is I describe my growing up years working in a restaurant, a chop suey restaurant in Seattle called the Hong Kong Restaurant. Many locals remember that because that was the big chop suey restaurant in Seattle's Chinatown for many years. I worked there for about 10 years myself, making some money so I could go to college. But, you know, it occurred to me, well, we read about a lot of food. Food is kind of a big thing. But do we know about the lives of the people who work there? My mother also worked in a sewing factory, actually a number of sewing factories in Pioneer Square in South Seattle area. And it occurred to me, well, who has ever heard the stories of our garment workers who formed the basis of the labor force that built the region? The cannery workers who were my friends, you know, we don't hear their stories. My family also came during the Chinese Exclusion Act period. So we were illegal immigrants living under the shadow of what we now experience with a whole nother wave of folks who are have been targeted under immigration restrictions. And so I wanted to share the fears and the uncertainties and the difficulties of that life. So that really was what allowed me to shape and create a structure for what stories I would hopefully include in the book.
What was that like? What did it feel like to go through those letters and all those journals and all that material when you were preparing to make this book, or as you were going? What did that feel like?
I was kind of reliving a lot of things, so a lot of memories, you know, and maybe that's why older people, they love sort of sitting around having nostalgic chats. You know, one memory triggers another memory. You know, when somebody prompts you to remember something that is forgotten, boy, you know, one, you know, it's one domino chip, you know, knocks over another one, and your mind starts flowing. So it was a wonderful experience, and it's sort of the joy, I think, of writing when you're able to do that. One additional piece which I didn't mention before, Jonah, is I also interviewed a number of folks to do this memoir, because it's sort of my memoir, but it's also a memoir of community and a generation and a time. So there were probably about 100 people who I texted, had coffee with, and spoke to over the phone to make sure that I could be precise on my details. And so I reconnected with quite a number of folks who also are acknowledged and listed in the book during the course of creating this.
What were some things that might have been unexpected when that might have popped up during these interviews, or again, while going through the material?
I would say in general, it was learning more about other people. You know people, but you don't really know them unless you ask. So there are a lot of things you take for granted, and you just don't know until you have that chance to have a further conversation. So I enjoyed that part of it, is revisiting my friends who I hadn't talked to in many, many years and decades. I also began to see patterns of how people were related to one another. So unless you stack all the pieces together in some fuller form, you don't see how we're all interconnected. I also, and this relates to this present time, Jonah, is, we've talked more recently about the rise in anti-Asian violence, and that's become front and center, I think. But it's always been there. And so you see the strain of, well, if you don't really know your history, you tend to relive it over and over. And again, it's a little bit of a cliche, but I began to see patterns of some of the what's happening now. I mean, it's always been with us, and we've never struggled and grappled with it successfully. And so this history keeps rising over and over again, and we're not able to grapple with it as a society. So I began to see the relevance of personal history, community history, in what is happening here and now.
Is there anything, I'm going totally off script, but I guess I should go back.
That's totally okay. I'm just going with you. So
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I should say to the rest of the people here, if you do have questions, put them in the chat now, so then when it's time for question and answer, we can just zip through them. My next question that I was supposed to ask second, how was your creative process influenced by your activism?
I spent 17 years in the museum field. Prior to that, I spent 13 years in community journalism. Those are two big chunks of my life. And actually the third, just to complete the puzzle, is I spent 10 years in community health as director of the International Community Health Services Foundation. So I have a chunk of time in which it seems kind of like three different things. One is as a community journalist, another a museum director, and a third in community fundraising for community clinics. Well, they all kind of are related and intertwined. I've always been really intensely interested in social justice and social change. I grew up in that era of the baby boomers, the Vietnam War, the women's movement, the emergence of, at the time, the term BIPOC hadn't emerged, or people of color. We called ourselves third world people, and there were other phrases along the way. So the language, the vocabulary has changed. Even Asian American as a term, Oriental Americans, a lot of things have changed. But I was always intensely interested, partly because of growing up in that era and also seeing the discrimination that I witnessed my parents going through, that I myself experienced. Was always interested in what can I do to help create a better society. And for me, it was all about working with community-based organizations and serving as witness for an advocate for people who have no voice in society. So we can do that as journalists. We can also do that as museum curators, presenters, exhibition developers. We can do that as community health clinic advocates. We can speak out for those who society still marginalizes. And so that's been the thing that's driven me and continues to drive me today. The creation of the book was really about, in this moment of in time, we're losing a generation of memory. The Seattle that once was is literally being bulldozed away. And, progress is progress, and some progress is necessary, but a lot of the memory of the contributions of people of color, for example, and particularly the Asian American community, is vanishing. As it relates to the Chinese community, there's a narrative now that's emerged of this model minority, successful tiger moms who drive their kids, straight A students and so forth, and college educated. Well, I mean, my parents never had a formal education. My mother never went beyond grade school. My dad came here as an immigrant labor and struggled and had a middle school education. We lived, my dad made $3,000 a year, made $1 an hour working 70 hours a week in a restaurant. The only thing I knew about music was that our family had to try to rent a musical instrument for school. We just didn't have money to buy it, so, all these tropes, all these ideas we have of, are not really true. So we have to find our own truths. And that really is about speaking our stories and sharing those with the public so that they see what is true and what is not.
Thank you. And my next question is a little unrelated. Well, who are some of your writing heroes?
Boy, that's a tough one. I'll say that I don't necessarily have any heroes, but this might be interesting to folks who are part of this discussion. The big question I faced was, how did I write this dang thing? How does somebody write a memoir? And for me, the little clue, the little magic formula was, I started reading some children's books, because you feel you have this big daunting task of creating something that's kind of a legacy piece. And so as I started to write, I just didn't know how to write this thing. I'm a journalist. I'm not a book writer. I write these short news articles. So I started reading children's books, and it was amazing. It freed my mind, because there's some wonderful children's authors. Beverly Clearly, I think that's how you pronounce it. I started reading some of her stuff. Lois Lemsky, a number of other children's authors who really spoke clearly and without pretension, with the goal of trying to connect with their readers. And so that allowed me to purify my mind, and just go basic and keep my sentences short, not try to overwrite. And so that was a wonderful experience. The other difficulty for me actually was in letting go. When I showed one of the first drafts to a friend of mine, early draft of the manuscript, a good friend of mine who was retired, but had worked in the Chinatown-International District area. No, he said, well, I love this. This is some great stories, people you profile, Donnie Chin, Bob Santos, uh, a number of activists, Larry Gossett, and all these folks that we knew. But, what's missing, Ron, is you write about these people, but it's almost like you're distancing yourself. I want to know what you think. And that was a little moment of revelation. It's like, well, I was kind of trying to be a reporter, but to be a reporter, you also have to expose yourself more in creating memoir. So I went back and then retooled my voice. And so that was very helpful.
Did you, was it difficult to retool your voice?
Not really. The greatest difficulty was in rewriting certain chapters. So, for example, I had a discrimination complaint against the University of Washington Daily when I was in college, and so I didn't want to write about it. So I wrote about it in a very distant kind of way, and I got that same comment from other folks. It says, you write this thing like it happened to somebody else, like, how did you feel? Weren't you angry? Did you feel any emotion? And it dawned on me that I had never dealt with that experience because of just the impact on me. So many years later, I couldn't write about it. So that one was a hard one to, but once I opened that door and wrote it, then a lot of the other manuscript just started to flow.
Would you say, so writing through some of these things from your past, revisiting your past through all the material, would you say writing this memoir might have been a bit of a healing experience?
Absolutely, and I would guess, not, again, being a newly minted author, not really being part of that author community in a way that others have been, I would bet that others who are have been authors for a while find some healing, some kind of exhilarating liberation that happens when they write. And I'm talking about people who are really deeply into the experience. There's something liberating about the experience of kind of digging a little deeper into yourself and being honest with yourself about the things that matter and the things that happen to you. But it's also a difficult experience. You can be pretty exhausted at the end of the writing of this. I wrote this, Jonah, during a time where I was working full time at International Community Health Services. So my routine was, the other thing is you got to find a routine, right? So my routine was I'd wake up at 4 o'clock, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd go run for an hour or so. The running actually sort of allowed me to just, my mind to float, so I would remember things. I'd come back, I'd write for about an hour or so, make breakfast for me and my kids, and wash up, get ready for work. So I had to have a routine. Now people see me on Beacon Hill and it's like, what are you doing, Ron? You're out there before the sun rises running. I said, well, it became a habit. And it's good, like for somebody my age, I'm turning 68 in another week. We have to watch our type 2 diabetes and all these other ailments that seem to befall us. So it's all good.
Well, happy early birthday.
Thank you.
Are you excited about any projects or organizing groups in Seattle right now? I know you just mentioned, or you mentioned earlier before I think I hit record, that you had done some meetings about projects. What are you excited about going on in Seattle or the Pacific Northwest as a whole?
Yeah, well, just on a personal level, first of all, I'm trying to pivot to, I'm not really retired, but I'm sort of semi-retired. So I'm still raising money for an aging in place facility on Beacon Hill. So that consumes a little bit of my time. But I'm also creating an audiobook version of my Unforgotten Seattle. And that was actually the impetus of a daughter of a friend of mine who said, well, there's a lot of us who are challenged in terms of reading, but we love to listen to books. And so I'm working with the the Washington State Talking Book and Braille Library to create an audio book version. So I'm actually practicing right now, listening to Michelle Obama's book as kind of try to figure out a voice and so forth. So I'm working on that. I also am working with the International Examiner newspaper, which, as I mentioned, is a beneficiary of this sales from the book, on a podcast, which I'm hoping documents and shares a lot of our local API stories. And then more broadly, I've thinking about some other writing projects and continuing a lot of the mentorship I do with a lot of younger folks. It really is their time. People say, well, shouldn't you be speaking out at these rallies and doing stuff? Well, number one, I'm kind of more of a documenter journalist. I prefer being behind the scenes. And so that's some of what I want to do. But I'm hopeful. We've got a new generation now that's very talented and doing a lot of the work that in my time, my generation was involved in.
What's the name of the podcast?
Well, I've been going around and around on it. I thought of calling it a Roncho's Chop Suey podcast, partly because that notion of chop suey has a lot of meanings. Chop suey is a Chinese American dish that is a combination of different elements that makes something that's very satisfying as something you eat. And so it's got long roots in this country. It also symbolizes the unity, the evolution of food, which as a metaphor also speaks to a lot of the organizing work that's happened in my experience between different communities of color and people who have come together from different backgrounds to fight for change. So that's what I thought of, and I'm going to have to talk to Jill Wasper, who I noticed is one of the participants, about an appropriate title. But I thought I could trigger it and maybe have guest podcasters. And the podcast idea actually came about because during my runs, which end up being a few hours I'm out there, I listen to podcasts, and it's kind of a cool media form.
That's really cool. We will keep an eye out for it because that sounds super awesome. Let's see. So those are all of Maya and Francis's questions. If anybody else has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and then ask. And then I give them, this is the part where I give them a window of time to see if anyone will bite. I do know that Debbie Eden has asked, if possible, I would love to hear you read another passage. So if you have anything, we would love to hear it.
Okay, let me, while we're sort of waiting there, let me flip through and see if there's something. And I should mention, by the way, there's a variety of stories in here, and some of it is funny, some of it's, I think, poignant. There's a chapter on when I was much younger for school, when I was in public schools. We were required to purchase a jockstrap for gym class or PE class. And remember, I've got immigrant parents like, what the hell is a jockstrap? Where do you buy that? So I described my search for a jockstrap. There's another chapter which talks about my mother's valiant efforts to try to learn how to speak English. So I became her tutor, and we spent many hours in her living room after dinner, looking through a Chinese English dictionary and trying to get her to figure out if she could pronounce certain English words which have no tonal basis in Chinese. So basically, she just kept flailing away trying to learn English, and then my attempts to try to translate things. But then in the process of that, I learned how to read and write Chinese, because she had to learn and I had to learn. So we met halfway. And to me, that was both a very funny chapter as well as a kind of a poignant one. She ultimately failed because she came here, in her 30s from a village in China, worked in the sewing factories for most of her life, and then after she retired, she wanted to learn English so she could be respected and understood when she went to the grocery store, and so that her children would respect her as well. She never quite mastered it, but she showed me that you're never too old to try. They're also, and actually, maybe I'll skip reading over a chapter because it'd be hard to dive in. They're actually full stories. There's another story that to me was very special. It's about a woman named Lily Yamada. She lived in the apartment building in Chinatown where I lived for a time. She was the closest person to the epicenter of the Hiroshima bomb who survived. And so I see her every day. She worked at the Wajimaya hair salon in Chinatown. And we chat, and she told me her story. She struggled with her health. There was a barbecue house down below us on the street level. And, the worst experience for her was in the morning when school kids would line up to catch the bus, hearing those kids shouting and screaming and so forth while waiting for the bus, and then smelling the barbecue pork hanging in the window down below. Because you see, it reminded her of when the bomb fell and when she saw people who literally, their faces had melted away and were screaming, crying, suffering, and then looking for water and dying before her. So she shared pieces of her story. I wrote it down, I kept it as a journal, and that's how I was able to share her story. She ultimately left. I never had a chance to say goodbye. She decided to return to Japan. She had, the radiation symptoms, bleeding at various times and so forth. And she returned to Japan to seek medical treatment, and but that left a profound impact on me. And so a lot of these stories are about people who are people just around you, and if you take time to listen to their stories, they're pretty powerful.
What is the big thing that you want people to walk away from after reading this book?
I would love for people to find some meaning in these stories that I think are our collective history. I want them to embrace them, regardless of their background. When I was growing up, it's interesting. There's this whole notion of how Asian Americans are viewed, and this has come up as well in discussions. part of the reason this China virus, Kung flu sort of, vocabulary resonates is this notion of us being perpetual foreigners, that we're not really, that we're sort of not, we don't have a place here. I wanted to say that we have a place here. My Unforgotten Seattle is about my roots here in Seattle. I'm third generation Chinese American. I'm the first American born generation, largely because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which meant that most of the Chinese who came before 1960s were here illegally because you couldn't come here. Now people say, a lot of people, it's not till more recently people have admitted to a lot of this, but I mean, that's what happened. So, but, we talk about a lot of these folks who have long history in the region. I never considered myself that. I always thought of myself as kind of like sort of not really belonging. But to me, I wanted to say, no, I belong. I'm here, been here for a long time. My dad's brother, my uncle, fought and died for this country during World War II. He was killed in Italy as part of the 87th Mountain Division. Fought in Italy, sacrificed his life for this country. But same time, my mother couldn't come here because of the Exclusion Act. So we have one foot here, one foot there. We're not quite accepted, but we're sort of stereotyped as a model minority. So there's a lot of contradictions at play. But at the end of the day, when people read this book, I mean, they'll see in very personal terms, because I document things, that we do have a place. And this is our history, and it's time for us to start writing it.
Thank you. Let's see, I saw somebody unmute themselves. And then they went away again.
That's Colin.
Sorry, that's me. Hold on a second.
Hey, Jill.
Can you hear me? I just wanted to say that my favorite chapter was chapter 6, which was Chinese foods and medicine.
Okay.
And it was also my mom's favorite. And it was because it
Really?
did recognize that, yeah, I know it's weird because it's a really good book and it's like 700 pages long and I'm in it and I'm still like, no, this is my favorite one. I guess people don't understand how much we relate to food in Asian culture, because at a certain point with first and second and third generation, that's all we have. And I never knew my first generation. I never knew my grandparents. And so for me, between my mom and me, who's Korean and I'm Korean American, all we had was food. All we had was this weird stuff that she would feed me. And like Ron, he talked about baby rats in a jar on his shelf, and you just didn't question it. You were like, yeah, when your friends came over, you were like, yeah, don't look at that shelf. But it meant something to our family. And so I that was my favorite chapter when you guys were talking about like, what was your favorite chapter to write?
Yeah.
But I sent it to my mom and I knew it. As soon as I sent it to her, I was like, Mom,
okay.
You're going to like this. And she was like, oh, this is my favorite chapter.
Well, we hold on to food because it's very dear to us. It's sort of our connection to who we are. One thing that people tend to forget is that food in the home was very, very important, and learning how to cook was very important, and knowing how to cook is very important. Nowadays, people go out and eat every day. It's like, back, when you're growing up in that era, who has the money to go out and eat every day? And if you're Chinese, you're working in the restaurant. You don't go out to eat. You're working there. So you rarely went out to eat. And so cooking, and which probably why people were healthier back then in some ways nutritionally, we actually made food from scratch. So I just marvel nowadays that people, have the luxury of being able to eat all the time out, and then they've lost their connection to food and actual, how you make this stuff. So, nowadays you go to, If you want broccoli, you could buy a big bag of cut up broccoli from Costco, right? Forget the stems and the other pieces. And, back in the day, everyone, you used all the pieces of the produce and the meat. We got the little pieces from the restaurant. We brought them home to use them for cooking.
We get so much produce now that it goes bad before we can use it all. And that's just not the way I was raised.
Yeah.
Jill, thank you for that. Let's see, any other questions? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, I have one last question. It is kind of related to food. I think you've mentioned a couple times now that you make breakfast for your kids. What is your favorite thing to make for them for breakfast?
Well, now, of course, they're older now. They're in their 20s, but usually I make stuff so breakfast is same as lunch, is same as dinner. It all interchanges. So, I usually make a variety of mixed vegetables, and that's a standard thing. So depending on what they like, could be a different mix of veggies. So I'm always making a ton of veggies. And there's this other thing, Chinese call it mukbang, and it's basically muk means meat. Biang means like biscuit or cookie. So it's literally like minced meat that you make with onions and oyster sauce and a few other ingredients. So very simple things. I should also mention, for my generation, most Chinese men know how to cook. I mean, and the reason why people say, yeah, how come it's, everybody, like Dean Wong, a friend of mine, all the Chinese Americans I grew up with, the men knew how to cook. Well, so remember, my parents grew up in an era, and my dad, for example, told me this. So the tradition in the Chinese immigrant community was the men went overseas to work. They couldn't bring the women over because of exclusion laws. So at age 13, when you complete your education, you went overseas, and you either went to join your father, or you went by yourself with some relatives overseas, and you have to fend for yourself. So you have to cook. So that was very early on taught to most of us, even of the baby boomer generation. So, if you're a guy, you got to cook. So your mother teaches you from early age, 10, 11, 12, here's how you make food. Also the other thing, I taught my son this when he was very young, how to iron your clothes. Now remember this, we grew up in this era before, the permapress, the different kind of fabrics emerged. So you had to know how to iron your clothes, but think about it in the context of Chinese American history. Chinese restaurants, these restaurants in these frontier towns, these little chop suey places, they fed the miners and railroad workers and others in the white community, because they knew how to cook, whereas a lot of, the non-Chinese are like, I don't know how to make food. Well, and then the hand laundries, well, that became a niche industry, but it's like, well, again, you're a 13-year-old, take care of yourself, iron your clothes, feed yourself, these kind of skills that, again, have sort of vanished now because we're in a different era. So just wanted to point that out too, which again unlocks some of the mystery behind what, the Chinese American presence here.
Thank you. I didn't know that. Okay, there is a question from Misha. They say they love the book. You also share a love of books and libraries. Can you share a memory or tell us what you have read lately?
What have I read lately? So I have a very eclectic diet of books. I'm trying to think now because I zipped through so many books. I read Howard Schultz's book recently, the one about I'm forgetting the title, but it's about Starbucks. I read some Beverly Cleary books recently. I just read Jean Godden's book about some of her reporting of Seattle politics and history. I read a lot of, is it Sue Grafton? Is she a mystery writer? Sue Grafton?
I think so,
I think-
yeah.
Yeah, it's like these alphabet books. So I've read a bunch of those. But I'm sort of forgetting a lot of books I just read. Because once I'm reading a bunch of H.G. Wells novels. A book titled Soul of a Bishop. Probably nobody's ever heard of, but he's more well known for War of the Worlds, Time Machine, and some other books. So I've got a whole pile of his books. I'm reading those. I'm reading a Sidney Poitier autobiography right now. So those are some of the things that I'm currently reading.
Thank you for answering that on the fly. I know I personally hate when people ask me that question.
Well, it's because I just don't remember. I just read because I just love to read. And so there's so many books I read. I can't remember what they are. So.
Well, we love readers here, so the more the merrier. Okay, Ron, this was great. It's been a blast. Thank you so much for, oh, there's another one. Never mind. If there is time, could you find and read the paragraph on how frugal Asian parents could be? It was something I identified with having parents raised in the Depression. Great book you wrote. This was
okay. Well, it might take me a minute or so, but I'm happy to indulge. So that one is probably, let's see. Wow. Okay. Fortunately, there's an index, so that allows me to kind of skip forward to, let's see. Okay. Let's see here. The problem is when you have 700 pages, it's kind of hard to kind of migrate your way through.
I mean, what would you even look up in the index? Frugal?
Well, I was looking up Sears because, but then there's a number of references to Sears. I mean, I'll explain to folks because it might take me a while to find it. But back in that era, parents are really, really frugal. Now I can't justify to the current climate and how people live, but you never threw anything away, and you never. Actually, there are a number of references in the book to frugality. So, like my parents, for Mother's Day and Father's Day, we'd buy stuff for them. They never wore any of this stuff. My dad, when he had passed away, I looked downstairs in the basement. Every single item of clothing that I bought for him was still sitting there, unopened. And it wasn't like he didn't appreciate it. He just felt like unless it had a hole in it, in which case then he would darn it or sew it because, he knew how to sew. He just couldn't spend any money. There's a reference to a conversation. I think that's probably what Isha is asking. We had a discussion one day at the International Examiner among the staff about who had the more frugal parents. And we began talking about the fact that, for example, my mother, any kind of styrofoam containers that were used for takeout food would be washed and reused. And so there's a pile on the dining table of styrofoam containers that were continually washed and reused. Serena and myself began talking about our mothers, respective mothers. Said, well, hey, my mother saves the hand towels, paper hand towels, after she dries them and just hangs them up and dries them again. So, hey, that's what my mother does too. Furniture in the living room. Why take the plastic off of lamps and furniture that you purchased? Because it keeps the dust off, right? So, Serena's mother used to dress their kids in bread sacks. I think they were Wonder Bread sacks, wrapping them around their shoes when they played in the snow, to keep the feet dry. So you got free pair of snowshoes. And then I describe Sears department store, which was in the Soto area of Seattle, and how they had a bargain basement. Things called it silapfong, which basically means like a garbage room. And so they could go there and buy stuff that was marked down a number of times. I describe it as kind of amusing to go there and see people fighting over, items that have been marked down so many times. It was almost like it was wild. People searching for these bargains. But again, keep in mind, I try to keep in context of these people came, my parents came with nothing. I mean, they were, dirt poor. And in that era when my dad's making $1 an hour, and of course my mom did a little better. She made $1.25 an hour working in sewing factories. But raising a family of 4 and also trying to support relatives in China, there's not a lot of dollars left over.
So I know I was wrapping up, but there was one more question that came in, and we have time for one last question. I think it's important. Silviano or Sylvian? It's just one word. In retrospect, while you were writing this, did you see the roots of the violent Asian hate we're experiencing today?
So it is Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia. She's a friend of mine who we have some connections. She's worked as a reporter for a number of years and shared a lot of neighborhood experiences. I think that revelation came about more recently, not immediately after I published the book. The book came out last year. But I began to sort of see a huge relevance and connection to what's happening today, more recently, just through the lens of a lot of the media coverage happening now. The big change really is now we have some voices of Asian American journalists who are speaking out. And that's exciting because we didn't have a whole lot of Asian American journalists, Asian American Pacific Islander journalists back in the day when Sylvia was working as a journalist. So, of course, Sylvia's one of the people who helped pave the way. But yeah, now I see with a lot of clarity the connection to my experience and what I wrote about and what's happening today. And so I would encourage people, if nothing else, the book will provide some context for how we can see what's happening here and now. If I could just, and I know we're wrapping up, a little shout out to, again, the International Examiner and Jill, if you're still with us, can testify the fact that if you want an autographed copy of the book, and I think we probably delivered some down to Orca, right? Orca Books. But if there's an interest in purchasing additional copies, either for use in the class or whatever, we're happy to accommodate and provide some opportunities, maybe for a little discount or something. Jill, what do you think? I don't know. We could talk about things. So.
All right, sure. Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep. Hear you loud and clear.
I think I just looked at this one. This one is not autographed. We got a couple of them from, I think, Ingram. But if you want to get an Orca Books, there are 2 Orca Books ones right now that are unsigned, but they were held by the host, which is a bargain. So thank you everyone for coming. Sylvia, I'm sorry I misread your name. I'm very dumb. Ron, thank you so much. This was great. I had a really great hour with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Jonah.
All right. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for coming. Oh, and the link is on the side of the chat. And I'm just going to copy that right now, and then I will put that on the live stream in the comments on Facebook, and then you can follow it that way. All right.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.